Let me set the stage. I'm Elise, 33, translator for a big shot company that keeps me on my toes with languages I barely knew existed until they handed me the dictionary. My life's not your typical fairy tale, it's more a series of plot twists. I married straight out of college, thinking I'd nailed life. But fast forward a few years, the marriage tanked, big surprise, right? But it gave me the best thing ever, my daughter Lily, a spitfire at 8, who has more wit in her pinky than most do in their entire head. Then, there's David, my current flame, or as I like to call him, Mr. Right the second time around. We bumped into each other at a dusty old book club. He was arguing about Hemingway's love of brevity, and I was all in for Fitzgerald's flair. Sparks flew over worn pages and tepid coffee. That was the start of endless debates and coffee dates. A year down the road, David popped the question at the same dingy coffee shop, with a ring as understated as our meeting. "Elise, will you?" He had started, all nervous, which wasn't his usual confident self. "Make your coffee every morning? Only if you promise to pick up your socks," I quipped, before slipping in a serious, "Yes, I will." But, as luck would have it, not everyone was popping champagne and tossing confetti. Enter Mrs. Thompson, David's mother, a tough nut with a stare that could curdle milk. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down like I was a sofa she regretted buying. "So, you're the one David can't stop yapping about," she had said, her voice sharp as a knife. "Guilty as charged. And you must be the famous Mrs. Thompson. David says you make the best cherry pie in town." From that day on, every visit was a chess game. She'd check my moves, always ready to declare a checkmate. But David was a gem. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, his way of saying, "Ignore her, I'm right here." One day, lounging on our rickety deck while David flipped burgers on the grill, he'd brought it up. "Mom's a bit old school, Elise. She's all about family legacy and that jazz. Yeah, and she's got it in her head that I'm done having kids. Thinks Lily's it and worries about the precious family line," I'd replied, the frustration bubbling up. David had put down the tongs, his face serious for once. I know. She's worried you won't want more kids. But whatever we decide, it's our business, not hers." Despite the gloom cast by David's mom, our wedding day was everything I'd hoped it would be, modest, but filled with joy. My daughter Lily was dolled up in a cute pink dress, practically floating around the venue, her laughter a melody that softened even the sternest hearts. Everyone we loved was there, smiling and cheering, except for one. Mrs. Thompson sat through the entire event with a face like she'd sucked on a lemon. She didn't even get up to congratulate us. Living with David, it felt like we'd hit the jackpot, warm, cozy evenings, and the constant buzz of a happy, albeit small, family. But as much as our home was filled with love, there was always an undercurrent of tension, thanks to one persistent storm cloud, Mrs. Thompson. One Saturday morning, while David was out running errands, Mrs. Thompson decided it was a good time to drop by unannounced. The doorbell rang just as Lily and I were in the middle of a heated Uno match. "Grams!" Lily shouted, dropping her cards and racing to the door. I followed more slowly, steeling myself. "Mrs. Thompson, what a surprise," I said, my voice polite but cool. She brushed past me without a greeting, her eyes sweeping the room like she was the health inspector and we were a restaurant on the brink of being shut down. "I was just in the neighborhood," she said, though we both knew she lived on the other side of town. "Thought I'd see what you all were up to without David around to supervise." As I headed to the kitchen, I heard her start in on Lily. "So, young lady, has your mother been keeping you busy, or are you just lazing around the house all day?" "We were playing Uno, and I was winning," Lily responded with a confidence I wished I could muster. "That's no real skill, is it? Why don't you read something more stimulating?" I returned with her tea, placing it on the coaster with a little more force than necessary. "Lily's top of her class, Mrs. Thompson. Uno's just for fun." Mrs. Thompson sipped her tea, making a face. "Well, as long as she's not falling behind. David tells me you're managing well enough, but I have to see it for myself." And making sure he's not burdened with more than he can handle is part of that. I sat down across from her, forcing a calm I didn't feel. David isn't burdened. He's thrilled. We all are. This is our family now. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Well, I'll let David know my thoughts. He deserves to hear it from his mother. As she walked to the door, I followed, my voice firmer now. David hears everything from me, Mrs. Thompson. We don't keep secrets or run reports to parents. We're adults, building a life together. She paused at the door, her back to me. Just remember, Elise. I'm his mother. My approval might not mean much to you, but it means a lot to him. Trying to get along with Mrs. Thompson was like trying to smooth a crumpled paper. No matter how hard you try, the lines are always there. But for David's sake, I kept at it. One evening, I decided to host a dinner. Nothing fancy, just a casual thing to maybe melt some of that ice. I'm making your mom's favorite tonight, cherry pie. Think it'll win her over? I asked David as he helped me set the table. David chuckled, straightening a fork. Mom's tough, but nobody can resist your cherry pie. Just take it easy, yeah? She can be, a lot. The plan was simple. Dinner at 6, pie for dessert, and hopefully some kind of truce by the end of the night. But as luck would have it, just as I pulled the pie out of the oven, looking golden and perfect, Lily's school called. Mom, it's Miss Carson. She says I left my project at school, and it's due tomorrow. Lily's face was a mix of panic and hope. Okay, we'll go get it. Can't have all your hard work go to waste, I said, glancing at the clock. Mrs. Thompson would be here any minute. I scribbled a quick note for her, just in case we missed each other. Back in 8. Make yourself at home. We rushed to the school and back, making it in just under 20 minutes. When we walked in, Mrs. Thompson was seated at the table, looking like she owned the place. David was pouring her a glass of wine. Dinner went by with the usual small talk. How's work, how's school, the weather, safe topics that kept the night from turning into a minefield. Then came the pie. I served everyone a generous slice, smiling a bit too eagerly. Hope it's as good as you remember, Mrs. Thompson. We all took a bite, and immediately, Lily's face scrunched up. Ugh, Mom, this tastes weird. Confused, I took a bite myself. My mouth was assaulted by a blast of salt and sour, a far cry from what I'd prepared. I looked up at Mrs. Thompson, who was watching me with a smug look. This doesn't taste right, Elise. Did you follow the recipe properly? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Of course, I made it just like I started, but then it hit me. She had been alone in the house. My eyes narrowed. David, noticing the tension, jumped in. Maybe it's just a bad batch of cherries? Let's not sweat it. How about we order some pizza instead? Sounds great, I managed to say, my eyes still fixed on Mrs. Thompson. After David went to order the pizza, Mrs. Thompson leaned in close and whispered, maybe next time you'll think twice before leaving me alone in your kitchen. I was stunned. She had actually sabotaged the pie. I kept my cool, though. Is this how you want to play it? Just making sure you know where you stand, she hissed back. The rest of the evening was a blur. Pizza came, we ate, and Mrs. Thompson left soon after, not a word about the pie. David seemed oblivious, happy even that we'd managed to salvage the night with takeout. Life after the pie incident felt like walking on eggshells, especially whenever Mrs. Thompson was around. But David, bless his heart, thought a change of scenery might do us some good. So, out of the blue, he comes home one evening, all smiles, waving a set of plane tickets like he's won the lottery. Guess what, Elise? We're going on vacation. And not just any vacation, India, he announced, practically bouncing on his heels. India? Seriously? I couldn't hide my surprise. India had been on my bucket list for as long as I could remember. But what about, your mom? David's face fell a bit, then he shrugged. Well, she's coming too. Thought it'd be good for all of us to spend some quality time together, bond a bit. I sighed, already dreading the drama, but not wanting to burst his bubble. Alright, if you think it's a good idea. When do we leave? In 2 weeks. I got it all planned out. We'll see the Taj Mahal, ride elephants, the whole 9 yards. His enthusiasm was infectious, and despite my reservations, I found myself getting excited about the trip. The weeks leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of planning and packing. Lists, shopping, more lists. The night before we were set to leave, David and I sat down with a map and a guidebook, marking out all the spots we wanted to visit. You really think your mom is going to ride an elephant? I joked, trying to keep the mood light. David laughed. I'd pay good money to see that. The day of the departure was chaotic. Bags everywhere, Lily running around in excitement, and Mrs. Thompson, well, she was her usual self, complaining about everything from the weight of her luggage to the timing of the flight. Why does it have to be so early? And why India? It's so far and exotic, she grumbled as we loaded up the car. Mom, come on, it's an adventure. Elise has always wanted to see India. We're going to have a great time, David tried to reassure her, giving me a wink. At the airport, Mrs. Thompson's mood hadn't improved. She fussed over her boarding pass, her seating arrangement, the lack of her preferred magazine at the airport shop. On the plane, Mrs. Thompson ended up seated separately from us, much to everyone's relief. She had managed to argue her way into an aisle seat closer to the front, away from our block of 3. As we soared above the clouds, heading towards an unknown experience, I couldn't help but wonder if this trip would bring us closer together or drive a deeper wedge. But ready or not, India awaited, and with it, a journey that was sure to be unforgettable. India was nothing short of an eye-opener, colors, chaos, and smells that could knock you sideways if you weren't careful. We'd been having the time of our lives, except, of course, for Mrs. Thompson, who found something to complain about at every turn. Still, David, Lily, and I were making the most of it, soaking up every experience. After a long day of sightseeing, we were back at the hotel, exhausted but happy. I was unpacking some of our stuff when I noticed Lily looking guilty, fidgeting next to her suitcase. What's up, Bug? You look like you're sitting on a secret, I nudged her gently. She bit her lip, then pulled out a package from her bag. Mom, look. Grandma gave this to me at the airport and told me to keep it a secret. She said it was a snack for when I get hungry. My heart sank as I saw the package. It was bacon. Lily, sweetheart, you know we can't bring meat into the country like this, right? It's against the law here. Lily's eyes widened, teary. I didn't know, Mom. Grandma said it was okay. Just then, David walked in. What's going on here? He asked, seeing the upset looks. I handed him the package, my voice tense. Your mom snuck this into Lily's bag. It's bacon, David. What? No, she wouldn't. His voice trailed off as he looked from the bacon to Lily's upset face. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do anything bad, Lily cried out. David knelt down and hugged her. It's not your fault, honey. You didn't know. He looked up at me, worry creasing his forehead. Elise, what are we going to do? First, we get rid of this properly. Then, we need to have a serious talk with your mother, I said, more annoyed than ever. David nodded, still shocked but supportive. Yeah, okay. Let's handle this. We managed to dispose of the bacon without any issues, thankfully. But the mood was set for a confrontation. We found Mrs. Thompson in the hotel lounge, sipping tea as if she hadn't a care in the world. Mom, can we talk? David's tone was firm as he approached her, a sign he meant business. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her expression wary. What is it now, David? Can't you see I'm trying to relax? David didn't waste any time. Why did you give Lily bacon to bring here? You know that's illegal. It could have gotten us in serious trouble. Mrs. Thompson scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, please, it was just a few slices. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not about the quantity, Mom. It's about following the law. And putting Lily in that position? Really? David's frustration was palpable. I stepped in, unable to hold back. Mrs. Thompson, what were you thinking? Putting your granddaughter in such a risky situation, just for what? A snack? She bristled, defensive. I was thinking of my granddaughter, unlike you, who drags her halfway across the world to places like this. That's enough, Mom. You're not making any sense, and what you did was wrong. Plain and simple, David cut her off. The conversation went around in circles for a while, with Mrs. Thompson refusing to see reason. But David stood his ground, and I couldn't have been prouder. Later that night, in our room, David apologized for his mother's behavior again. I'm sorry, Elise. I never thought she'd go this far. It's not your fault, David. But we need to be more careful with her. Who knows what else she might pull, I said, the day's events weighing heavily on my mind. David nodded, pulling me close. We'll handle it, together. No more secrets, no more sneaking around. We're a team, right? Right, I agreed, feeling a bit better knowing we were in this together. Still, as I watched Lily sleep peacefully, unaware of the storm her grandmother had almost caused, I knew this trip was going to be more than just a vacation. It was a test of our family's resilience. Our trip to India turned out to be way better than I feared. We saw incredible places, and even Mrs. Thompson kept her cool, which made me think maybe I had been too harsh on her. By the end of our trip, I was almost relaxed about her being around us. Maybe, just maybe, we could all get along after all. The day we were to head back, everything seemed smooth. We were at the airport, luggage in tow, checking off the last items from our travel list. That's when Lily tugged at my sleeve, her face scrunched up a bit. Mom, I need to go to the bathroom, she whispered. Sure, sweetie. Let's go, I replied, turning to Mrs. Thompson. Could you hold my bag for a minute? She smiled, a bit too sweetly. Of course, dear. Handing over my bag, I led Lily to the restroom, thinking nothing of it. When we came back, Mrs. Thompson was standing there, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she handed back my bag. Thanks, I muttered, but something about her expression set off alarms in my head. I didn't dwell on it, just handed the bag to David. Here, can you take this through? My hands are full. Sure thing, he said, slinging it over his shoulder as we headed to the security checkpoint. Lily and I passed through first, easy and clear. I waited on the other side, watching as David placed the bag on the conveyor belt. That's when everything went sideways. The security officers at the monitor started whispering urgently, pointing at the screen before motioning David aside. 2 more officers approached, their faces stern. What's going on? I called out, stepping closer, but a security officer held up a hand to stop me. Ma'am, please wait here, he said. Panic clawed at my chest as I watched them talk to David, his face growing paler by the second. Then, without warning, they escorted him to a small room off to the side. Mrs. Thompson rushed over and grabbed my arm, her earlier smugness replaced by concern. Elise, what's happening? Why are they taking David? I pulled my arm away, keeping my voice steady, despite the chaos. I gave him my bag to carry through the scanner. They found something in it, something that shouldn't have been there. Her eyes widened, and for a second, I saw fear flicker across her face. Without another word, she tried to follow the officers who took David, but the customs officials stopped her. That's when she lost it, her composure cracking like thin ice underfoot. It was me. I did it. I put those things in her bag, she shouted, trying to push past the officers. The officers, now alert to a deeper issue, brought her back to where I was standing. They started asking rapid-fire questions. It was then that Mrs. Thompson broke down completely, crying and shaking as she confessed. While Elise was with her daughter, I put the money and medicines in her bag, she sobbed, her voice echoing in the busy airport. I wanted her to get caught, to be held back here while we went home. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was one thing to suspect your mother-in-law didn't like you, but another to hear her admit to framing you. The customs officers took us all aside to sort through this mess. As we stood there, with officers buzzing around, taking notes, Mrs. Thompson turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Elise, I'm so sorry. I thought if you were out of the picture, David would come back, that he'd realize his mistake. But I was wrong, so wrong. Please, can you forgive me?" I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and pity. "You didn't just make a mistake. You almost ruined our lives." The officers had listened to everything, and after confirming the story with the surveillance footage, they decided to release David. He came back to us, his face a mask of shock and relief. When he saw his mother in handcuffs, something inside him seemed to break. "Mom, how could you?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise around us like a knife. "I wanted to protect you," Mrs. Thompson cried, trying to reach out to him. The police took Mrs. Thompson away to process her for the crimes she admitted to, leaving us in a bubble of stunned silence. As we headed to the gate to catch our rescheduled flight, I leaned on David, the events of the day replaying in my mind. His mother's actions were unforgivable, and as we walked, a plan began to form on how we would move forward, how we would rebuild the trust and safety that had been so severely shattered. Back home, the silence of our living room felt like a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the airport police station. David and I sat with cups of tea that had long gone cold, the events of the past few days settling around us like dust after a storm. David broke the silence first, his voice low and weary. "I can't believe she'd go that far, Elise. I'm sorry you had to go through all that because of her." I looked over at him, seeing the strain in his eyes. "It's not your fault, David. But we do need to think about how we move forward from here. We can't let this slide." "Yeah, I know." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The lawyer mentioned a restraining order might be necessary. Given everything, I think he might be right." It was a tough pill to swallow, the idea of legally barring his mother from our lives, but it was a measure of the severity of her actions. It would give us peace of mind, at least. She needs to understand the consequences of her actions, legally and personally. David nodded, rubbing his face with his hands. "Yeah, I'll call him tomorrow. Get it started. It's just hard, you know? She's my mom." I reached out, taking his hand. "I know she is. And this doesn't mean you don't love her. But we have to protect our family, David. We have to protect Lily." A few days later, the restraining order was in place. It was a surreal feeling, knowing that it had come to this. When David told Lily, he did it in a way that was gentle, but honest. "Grandma made some very bad choices, and for now, we need to make sure we're all safe," he explained to her. Lily nodded, her understanding far beyond her years. "Is Grandma going to be okay?" she asked, her small voice full of concern. "We hope so, sweetheart. We hope she gets the help she needs," I added, pulling her into a hug. Life started to settle into a new kind of normal. The days passed with fewer worries about unexpected disruptions, and slowly, the tension began to ease from our shoulders. Mrs. Thompson had spent 2 months in a local prison and was then deported back to the United States. The image of her, desperate and broken, was stark, but it was her actions, not mine, that led us here. Days passed, and the ripple effects of Mrs. Thompson's actions were felt throughout our wider circle of family and friends. People who had once been fixtures in our lives began distancing themselves from her. Her betrayal wasn't just personal, it was profound, affecting everyone connected to us. She lived alone now, isolated by her own deeds. It was a harsh reality, but a self-inflicted one. One evening, as we sat watching a movie together, wrapped in blankets and sharing a bowl of popcorn, David paused the movie and looked over at me. "Elise, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. And I just want to say thank you. For being so strong, for being the rock for this family." I smiled, leaning into him. I do it for us, for all of us. Because that's what you do when you love someone, you stand by them. As we resumed the movie, I looked over at Lily, her eyes heavy with sleep, safe in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. Reflecting on everything, I realized that family isn't just about the good times. It's about who stands with you during the trials, who holds your hand when the path gets rocky.